Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 10. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I noticed a few people joined since last week. I welcome all of you newcomers to African History Club. I welcome all the existing members. I hope all of you find this journey that we've been having into Africa's past. I hope you find it rewarding. I hope you find it enlightening. I hope you find it inspiring even. So today, episode number 10, we're going to be looking at the enslavement regime. And I prefer to use enslavement and refer to enslaved people rather than slaves. I don't think people were ever slaves. And there's a distinct difference in terms of saying slaves or enslaved. Slavery or slave almost suggests a permanent condition. But when you say enslaved person, it implies that there's a constant rebellion, a constant resistance, whether it's manifest and obvious, whether it's intellectual, but there's always a state of rebelling against that condition of being enslaved. So for the sake of the memory of those who were enslaved throughout history, I would encourage people to remember them as people that had been enslaved and not as slaves. Even those at their dying moments, when they knew they were about to die, whether of utter exhaustion, being worked to death, or whether they were being castrated or lynched or quartered, as they used to also do. Imagine even at that moment, they might have seen that as their final act of resistance, of parting this world and no longer having the enslaver extorting or exploiting their labor. So what was the whole institution of enslavement about? I prefer to see it the way Walter Rodney, the late Walter Rodney, saw it. It's part of the entire system of how Africa and other parts of the world, but of course our podcast is focusing on Africa, how Africa was integrated into the global economy in a peripheral and dependent condition, with the center sometimes referred to as the metropolis being the European empires. So Africans were enslaved to build the wealth and prosperity of Europeans. Africans were taken in the millions to the Americas to work the land in terms of the agricultural production and in terms of producing the gold and the silver that allowed Europe to empower its economy and ultimately for England to become an industrial power through the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution owes its legacy to the profits of the enslavement of Africans. James Watt's steam engine owes its creation to the profits of enslavement of Africans. Great cities that became major financial powers, like Amsterdam, owed its power to the enslavement of Africans and the gold and silver mined by enslaved Africans. Great port cities such as Liverpool owes its growth and wealth to the enslavement of Africans. The United States never would have become a powerful economy and ultimately an industrial power were it not for the profits of enslaved Africans. By 1830, for example, cotton produced by enslaved Africans accounted for 50% of United States export earnings. That was the sweat and toil of enslaved Africans. So Europe never would have become the global economic power that it became and still is. And the same for the United States, were it not for the enslavement of Africans and the profits generated from the enslavement. And that is why when people say, should there be a debate about reparations for enslavement? What is there to debate? It's just a matter of an accounting. That's what needs to be done. Now, some apologists have always pointed out that enslavement existed in Africa historically as well. That is true. Just like in all societies, as human societies and communities and nations evolved, confrontations occurred, wars occurred between nations, and in those wars, captives were taken and they were compelled into servitude. So yes, that does apply to Africa as well. There's a vast distinction between that type of servitude, which was also known and occurred in Africa, compared to the European Atlantic enslavement enterprise. So, for example, in Africa, those captives forced into servitude, depending on which region we're discussing, but in some West African nations, those in servitude would be compelled into agricultural production, or they could be compelled to join the army of the nations that had vanquished their own nations. And in some cases, they emerged as commanders in those armies and gained positions of prominence. In some cases, these captives forced into servitude were able to intermarry and integrate in these societies where they had become captives in servitude. They were able to inherit from their captors / masters. They were able to become prominent citizens of these nations that had captured them after warfare into servitude. Now, this is, of course, vastly distinct from the chattel slavery that we saw in the Americas when enslaved Africans were auctioned off, were forced to work like animals on those plantations in the South, subjected to the most cruel forms of torture, lynchings, castrations, and quartering, and to live as subhumans, and in most cases, in worse condition than the livestock of their enslavers. And then the cost was overwhelming to Africa. The cost of the Atlantic enslavement enterprise. First of all, in human cost alone, it's been estimated that anywhere from 10 to 15 million enslaved Africans landed in the Americas. It's been estimated that the mortality rate during the voyage across the Atlantic, sometimes referred to as the Middle Passage, or Maafa in Kiswahili, MAAFA, which is a word for Holocaust. The mortality rate was anywhere from 15 to 20%. The mortality rate was also high during the journey from the interior of Africa to the coast from where they were shipped to the Americas. The numbers in terms of the loss of human life is even hard to comprehend. But there's one way to gauge the impact of enslavement on the population of Africa. So here I'm using an estimate from Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. In 1650, this is the estimate, the population of Africa was 100 million. At the same time, the population of Europe was 103 million. By 1850, population of Europe, 274 million. Population of Africa, 100 million. 1900, population of Europe, 423 million. Population of Africa, 120 million. So we see that from 1650 to 1850, literally, population growth had stagnated in Africa during this era of enslavement in the European transatlantic slave enterprise, and only moved up slightly by 1900. Let's look at more recent years to see the dramatic impact of what the ending of the enslavement regime had in terms of the population impact in Africa. 2016, population of Europe, 742 million. Population of Africa, 1.2 billion. So So that gives you a good consideration of what the impact of enslavement was in terms of its destruction of the population in Africa. And most of these taken were the most able-bodied and productive men and women. It's been estimated that the ratio was 2-1 in favor of men. And these were men who were highly skilled relative to that era. These were people that had expertise in agricultural production, people who had expertise in mining, people who had expertise in iron work. So they were removed from productive activities in Africa. And it's not hard to imagine the consequences. And it's true, agricultural production diminished, and some countries that had food surplus ended up facing and suffering from famine. And then another very destructive aspect was the warfare and instability that the enslavement regime introduced in Africa. Whereas in the past, there had been wars of contestation over resources, wars as nations attempted to expand and encroached on the lands of other nations. Now, a new form of warfare was introduced to satisfy the European demand for enslaved Africans. And that was warfare or raids specifically targeting the kidnapping of other Africans to exchange them with the Europeans who took them to the Americas. And what were they exchanged for? They were exchanged for cast-off uniforms from Europe, the exchange for pots, exchange for beads, exchange for antiquated guns that Europeans wanted to get rid of, exchange for gunpowder. So the wars caused tremendous instability in Africa. Nations that fight over resources or fight wars of expansion are not constantly in warfare. When two nations fight, there's a winner and a loser. And typically, each side assesses its losses or gains and perhaps wait for another opportunity to try to make up what they perceive as a loss or a gain. But now, with this new kind of warfare, there's no resting period. There's no time to assess losses and gains. It is a constant war to satisfy an unquenchable appetite, the demand for enslaved Africans. And you already saw an indication of its destruction over the 3 and more centuries that it lasted in terms of its impact on Africa's population. On the other hand, Europe was gaining. The labor of Africans enslaved in the Americas produced tremendous wealth for all the European empires engaged in the enslavement enterprise. The Africans taken to the Americas produced the agriculture, produced the gold, produced the silver, these were not shipped back to Africa. These goods were shipped to Europe, where for centuries, this constant, continuous activity created great European economic powers to the detriment of Africa. And accompanying this enslavement regime on the plantations, the ideology of white supremacy and racism was also fortified. In a very persuasive lecture given at Columbia University in 1980, the late Walter Rodney argues that whereas, yes, slavery can be traced to a pre-capitalist era, it was during this period when capital was expanding globally, particularly when we look at the plantation societies where racism took a decisive and unique role, where racist policies now play the determining factor in terms of how labor and the hierarchy of labor was determined based on race. And in order to justify that allocation based on race, a racist philosophy and white supremacy had to be used to rationalize this new form of exploitation. The title of that lecture is called Race and Class in Guyanese Politics, and I highly recommend that. So there came a time when enslavement and plantation enslavement and production became an impediment for the development of capital, especially after the Industrial Revolution in England, and it spread other parts of Western Europe and later to the United States. And now capital desires cheap wage labor, wage employees, and consumers of products coming out of the factories. So then suddenly, lo and behold, the same advocates who had once praised the virtues of enslaving Africans were now at the forefront of abolition. So Britain, for example, stopped trade in enslaved Africans in 1807, and ultimately in 1833 passed the Abolition of Slavery Act. So that was Britain. In the United States, it took a civil war between the South and the North, the industrializing North, which now desired wage labor, and the old South that was still benefiting from the surplus deriving from the labor of enslaved Africans. And then ultimately, with the defeat of the South in 1865, with the 13th Amendment, enslavement was abolished in the United States, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In the case of France, enslavement was first abolished in 1794 after the uprising in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which of course later on became Haiti. Napoleon Bonaparte reintroduced enslavement in 1804. That was, of course, the year when sisters and brothers in Haiti declared the first republic of African descendants in the Western world with the great victory of the Haitian Revolution. France ultimately abolished enslavement in 1848. There were Africans who resisted European enslavement. Africans that fought against Europe. And there were, of course, Africans that surrendered and undermined Africans that fought against enslavement. One outstanding general that needs to be recognized was Queen Nzinga of the Ndongo and Matamba Empire. Ndongo, and Matamba is Matamba. She resisted Portuguese enslavement from 1630 until 1648. And then Portugal, in alliance with other African neighboring nations, able to overwhelm Queen Nzinga, and ultimately, in the 1650s, she yielded and allowed the enslavement enterprise to continue in her empire. Another one was King Agaja Trudeau, Agajatrudo, of what was the Kingdom of Dahomey, Dahomey, which is now a part of the modern nation of Benin. And he resisted European enslavement from the 1720s until 1730. And he attacked the camps of the European enslavers and burnt them down. And he attacked the routes that led into the interior of Africa from where enslaved Africans were procured. Ultimately, the Europeans deprived his empire of trade in legitimate products. So we could in fact see it as an 18th century type of economic embargo. And also, in alliance with other neighboring African nations, they were able to put enough pressure on King Agaja to force him to allow the resumption of the enslavement enterprise. And now, with the abolition in Britain, in France, in the United States, we're now in the mid-19th century. So now, was this a breathing period for Africa? Was this when Africa would finally have time to take stock in the damage that occurred over more than 3 centuries? Was this an opportunity for Africa to now seek restitution from the European empires for the extortion, exploitation, and theft as a result of the enslavement enterprise? No. there was no breathing space at all. Because as the old-fashioned orthodox form of enslavement was ending, colonialism was dawning on Africa. And that will be the subject of our podcast episode number 11. So we now come to a conclusion of episode number 10. And I recommend Pre-Colonial Black Africa by the late Anta Diop, Professor Anta Diop, ANTA-DIOP is his last name. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Walter Rodney. Rodney, of course, is R-O-D-N-E-Y. The African Slave Trade by Basil Davidson. B-A-S-I-L-D-A-V-I-D-S-O-N. He was a British historian, and compared to many of the European historians on Africa, he was relatively very progressive. But when you read him carefully, you see that even he often did not go far enough. There was an occasional element of Eurocentrism in his works as well. And then I finally recommend the lecture by Walter Rodney that he gave at Columbia University, and that is available on YouTube. Race and Class in Guyanese Politics. And you will be able to see for yourself why I am such a big fan of the late Walter Rodney. Thank you once again to the new guest and to the existing guest. I look forward to rejoining you next week as we look at the European conquest, the African resistance, and ultimately colonization of Africa. Thank you.